which of Allah's favors can we deny? Above all creatures He chose us to be high. To Him we belong, to Him is our return. Life in this world is only a sojourn. To the angels He commanded that man be respected. Shaitan he did not, and so was he rejected. Compared to the angels, we are but clay. As long as Allah we obey, we'll not go astray.
Assalamu alaikum, and a very warm welcome to a new edition of Islamic Law. As always, you can always contact us at Islamic Law Today at huda.tv. You can always find us on Facebook at Islamic Law Today. So why not leave your comments on Facebook? Today we have a very important issue to discuss. We're going to actually discuss the fiqh of novelties. Now we have joining us today a very renowned scholar, not only on Huda Academy. We have Dr. Hatem Al-Hajj. Assalamu alaikum, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining us today in the studio.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
You're more than welcome, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining us. The Doctor is a renowned author of the book Fiqh of Worship. Doctor, today we're discussing a very important issue, fiqh of novelties. Let me start off by asking you, what do we mean by the fiqh? First of all, what is fiqh? Briefly explain to us.
Well, fiqh in the language means understanding. It is basically the correct understanding of the religion in the terminology of the early Muslims. So when the Prophet ﷺ used the word fiqh in a hadith that is reported by Bukhari and Muslim from Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, he said, "Man yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqihu fi ad-din." When Allah wants good for someone, He would give him a good understanding of the religion. So that it just meant, generally speaking, a good understanding of the religion. Later on, the scholars divided the Islamic sciences into the various disciplines, and that is basically to facilitate and simplify things for us. So they put the practical rulings separately under one discipline, which they called fiqh, and then the rulings that pertain to belief or faith, they put them under one discipline that's called Aqidah. The earlier scholars called it Sunnah, and they put the rulings, or they put the science that pertains to Hadith under a separate discipline, and so on and so forth. So fiqh became the science of the practical rulings, and they define it as معرفة الأحكام الشرعية العملية المستنبطة من أدلتها التفصيلية, which means recognition of the practical rulings, practical rulings of the religion that are deduced from the detailed evidence. So basically it pertains to your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and your relationship with the creation, the creator and the creation. Your relationship with Allah is governed by fiqh of worship, because that is the type of relationship you worship God.
Of course.
And your relationship with the creation is called fiqh al-mu'amalat. The first one is fiqh al-ibadat, fiqh of worship. The second is fiqh al-mu'amalat, fiqh of transactions or interactions, because here you're dealing with your equals. So it's fiqh of interactions. And that fiqh will certainly be divided into categories. There are financial and family laws and so on and so forth.
There's so many editions of fiqh. So, Dr. Hatem, we're talking also today about novelties. Quickly explain to us about the novelties of the fiqh.
Novelties basically from the word, the meaning of the word itself, you can figure that this is the fiqh of matters that emerged after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, things were different. Whenever something would arise, the answer to it would come from the Quran or from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So it was much simpler because the Prophet would either receive a revelation or the Prophet would reason it out and provide the ruling. The ruling could be a matter of revelation, or it could be a matter of the Prophet's reasoning. If the Prophet's reasoning was approved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that'll be it. And
Okay.
if there is some comment from the divine on the ruling, then a revelation would descend
Okay.
onto the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But afterwards it became different because the revelation had stopped.
Okay, so it seems very clear to myself, Dr. Hatem, that the revelations were given to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he passed these on forward to the messengers and the people,
To the disciples.
disciples. Okay, so Doctor, talk about the wisdom behind the actual things in the Quran, the glorious Quran. I want to know the wisdom behind the novelties. Did they have novelties, obviously, in the day of the Prophet ﷺ? Have they changed?
Well, the issue here is novelties as newly emerging matters. So it's like anything that rise.
Can you give us some examples,
the time
Doctor?
of the Prophet ﷺ. So, for instance, when the Prophet ﷺ, the Battle of Badr, after the Battle of Badr, what should we do with the captives of the Battle of Badr? That's a novelty. In other words, we have not been through this before. This was the first battle between the Prophet ﷺ and the polytheists of Quraysh, and first time they have captives, so it's a novelty. There were other novelties during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Pretty much every new ruling during the time of the Prophet ﷺ was basically a novelty, because it's an initiation, instigation of a new ruling pertaining to some matter that arose. So sometimes the Quran would come with some rulings pertaining to issues, certain issues, without those issues happening in the reality. Most of the time, the Quranic revelation and the Sunnah was like an answer to an issue that happened in the reality.
I understand, yes. So, Dr. Hatem, let me ask you very kindly, do people view the Quran's or the Sunnah belief fiqh in different ways? For example, if I was to understand fiqh and you were to understand fiqh, obviously you're a scholar of fiqh, would your understanding be different than mine? Or would I follow what you think is correct? How do we know it's definitely 100% correct to follow the fiqh of this time?
Well, as in any discipline of knowledge or science, certainly people vary in their understanding, their knowledge of the discipline and their understanding of it, and the authority of the people would vary based on this, and the people of this knowledge would know who is higher authority and who is to be listened to on the subject or not. But we're all required to exert our effort, maximum effort, into understanding the various rulings, everyone within their capacity. You cannot be completely certain of the correctness of a position unless it is a matter of consensus.
Yes.
And those matters of consensus, that consensus adds the certainty to the particular position or opinion. Because when all of the scholars of this ummah of the Prophet ﷺ agree on a matter at a certain time, then it makes this a matter of certainty.
I see. So clearly, Dr. Hatem, the majority of people believe in the fiqh of what we are understanding today. The majority of people.
Yes.
Yes. So, Doctor, how would they address the issues of novelties in the day of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? How would they address these novelties?
In the day of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was like I said, it was pretty straightforward. When the Prophet ﷺ would encounter an issue, or the Sahaba would encounter an issue, they'd come to the Prophet ﷺ and ask him, and then the Prophet ﷺ would either receive a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the Quran or through the other forms of revelation, and communicate the answer to the Sahaba, or would use his reasoning sallallahu alaihi wasallam and provide the answer, which will later be approved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not. If it is approved, then there will be no further revelation from Allah, but if it is not, then a revelation would descend on the Prophet ﷺ to correct the earlier position.
I see. So, Doctor, obviously, you know, you're actually a dean of a university teaching the fiqh and things like this, even on Huda Academy. You know, mashallah, this is an excellent academy for people. How has it changed in modern day? How would we address these issues today?
We would address them, certainly. We are not in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, so you can't go and ask directly, but we would have to use the usul al-fiqh, or the fundamentals of jurisprudence, and fiqhi principles or maxims to arrive at the correct ruling. First, you look into the Quran and you try to find if there is an answer in the Quran. And then you look into the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, try to see if there is an answer in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and certainly the matters of ijma' would add certainty to those answers. But if you don't find something in the Quran or the Sunnah that would give you an answer to this issue, then you would be reasoning. You would use your ijtihad. You make ijtihad, which is, you know, analogical deduction. Qiyas is analogical deduction. There are other forms of ijtihad also, but qiyas would usually be, you know, your tool, and that you can use to arrive at the correct answer. It is analogical deduction. It is basically trying to find if there was something during the time of the Prophet ﷺ that is similar to this or not. So cocaine, for instance, if that's a novelty, because there was no cocaine during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, can we find something that is similar to it? Wine would be similar to it. And, you know, even according to some of the scholars, this is not a matter of analogical deduction. It is coming straight forward from the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, كُلُّ مُسْكِرٍ خَمْرٍ, every intoxicant is khamr. Or every intoxicant is wine, or alcoholic, is like alcoholic beverages. So the idea here is that's the process. But then there are many other tools that we can use. We said analogical deduction was the last one that we talked about there, but there is also consideration of public interest, which is maslaha al-mursala or istislah. There is also the fatwa of even before consideration of public interest, the fatwa of a sahabi, fatwa of a companion, religious edict of one particular companion that we can apply to this matter, or we can even use analogical deduction here. And then there is the consideration of public interest. There is also said the dhara'a, blocking the means to evil. So if we find that this matter would result into like some evil, then it would be forbidden because of what it leads to. And that is called blocking the means to evil, or said the dhara'a. We also look at presumption of continuity, original non-liability. Presumption of continuity means basically istishab, which is to presume that everything, you know, to presume that, you know, the original default applies, or the default ruling applies to the new matter. Part of this also is the original non-liability, which means that it is called al-bara' al-asliya in Arabic. It means that everything is permissible until proven otherwise. And that is a basic ruling in Islam. Like, you need a proof on the impermissibility, not the permissibility, because everything is permissible until proven otherwise. That's certainly aside from the area of worship. because in the area of worship, you need to worship Allah according to what you have received. So you can't invent acts of worship.
Yes.
But in dealing with the creations, everything is permissible until proven otherwise.
Of course, Dr. Hatem, as a newly reverted Muslim myself, it was quite crucial for me to find out how I should pray and how I should act upon my deen. So one question I want to ask, Sheikh, which is very, very urgent, that coming from the West, how can I apply fiqh in my life if I was living in the West? Because it's quite easy to apply the rulings in Eastern countries. However, some of the rulings, if I go to the UK or any other European country, they may think, oh, you're strange, and they would not allow me to apply. So how can I best apply them in non-Muslim countries?
Well, the golden rule here is called فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, fear Allah as much as you can.
Yes.
It's also called, as the Prophet ﷺ said, مَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِأَمْرٍ فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. Whenever I command you to do something, do of it as much as you can. وَمَا نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْ شَيْءٍ فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ. And whenever I forbid you from something, then desist or refrain from it. So it is easier to refrain from things than to do things, right? So that's what the Prophet ﷺ said. You know, when it came to the obligations, he said, do of them as much as you can. And when it came to the prohibitions, he just said refrain, because it's easier to refrain than to do. So in this case, you will do of those rulings as much as you can. But certainly, no one can deceive Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah knows our capacity much better than we even know them. So within your capacity, but don't fall short of reaching your capacity.
Yes, it's very crucial, that, Dr. Hatem. I also want to pick up on the point, your book, the fiqh of worship. I want to ask you, what was the inspiration behind this book? Because, we were talking earlier about the book. What was the inspiration? What was the inspiration of the book?
Because I was teaching fiqh at the College of Islamic Studies, belongs to Mishka University. And this book was actually written on the job, sort of. It was written for the students of the university, and the students contributed to it. Also, they reviewed it. They contributed some diagrams and so on. So that's how it came about.
MashaAllah, may Allah accept this work.
Thank you.
Dr. Hatem, also you're a renowned scholar on Huda Academy. Very quickly, I'd like you to share with us what points of novelties you actually address, or do you actually address them in the Huda Academy?
I do teach fiqh with Huda Academy, but so far we have been teaching fiqh of worship. So the novelties will not be too many, but there would be some novelties as well.
Okay.
In worship in general, you would have limited number of novelties, but we can certainly think of some novelties that pertain to worship, such as public transportations now. They're quite different. People travel by air, for instance, which would create some issues with your prayers, your fasting. Those questions are considered to be novelties because they were, no one asked them before. Or if people asked, close by questions, they were not particularly about airplanes and people traveling by air. There is a time difference, and you go through many time zones while you're traveling by plane. So those would be considered, somewhat novelties, and they still pertain to fiqh of worship. Most of the novelties, however, would pertain to fiqh of transactions or fiqh of interactions.
The new novelties. That's great, Doctor. Let me just ask you very kindly, where would we start on learning fiqh of novelties? Where would the beginning point be?
Well, the fiqh of novelties is something that is usually not taught, to beginners. Fiqh of novelties is taught to people who had already studied fiqh per se, you know, and then that would be a specialized matter. But how do the scholars address fiqh of novelties when the scholars, modern scholars, encounter a novelty, such as, you know, in vitro fertilization, for instance? It's a novelty. The prenatal testing of embryos, and that is also a novelty. DNA testing and the, you know, proof of parenthood through DNA testing, matters of the beginning of life, the end of life, removal of life support, novelties. All of those are novelties. You know, the banking system and all of the different transactions in the banking system, different stock market, etc. All are novelties.
Everything.
So how do the scholars address them? They would look to the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, to see how, to learn from them how they addressed the novelties after the death of the Prophet ﷺ.
Doctor, where do the scholars, you've mentioned they get their information from the Sahabas of Muhammad ﷺ. However, how do they deliver that message? How do they conclude and say this is the final evidence? Who makes that final decision? Is it one scholar or many scholars?
Okay, that's a good question, because even during the time of the Sahaba, there was collective ijtihad jama'i, or collective ijtihad. The Sahaba would sit together and address the issue and arrive at a conclusion. During the time of the Tabi'een, Imam al-Dhahabi in his book Siyar A'lam al-Nubala tells us that the 7 great jurists of Medina during the time of the Tabi'een, the followers of the Sahaba, whenever something new happened, they used to convene, they used to meet, and they used to address it, and they would come out with an, from the meeting with an answer. So collective ijtihad is the proper way to address the novelties, particularly if they are serious, important matters. The best way to address them is the collective ijtihad. We do have fiqh assemblies, or these are assemblies of like a large number of scholars that also invite those assemblies, invite the experts in different fields to sort of brief the scholars on the new issue that arose, and to help the scholars arrive at the correct conclusion. Because part of that step of fiqh, or making of fiqh, is to be aware of that which you are judging, the matter itself that you are addressing. To be aware of cocaine and what does it do to the human being, for instance. You can't judge it without proper knowledge of the matter itself.
Of course, Doctor. Let's move on and talk a little bit about the students and the college. How do they actually come up with ideas and say, Dr. Hatem, is this a novelty? Do they try to say to you, Doctor, can we do this? Is this correct? Or do they come up with some silly novelty that they think, is a good idea?
Yeah, novelties would be, so sometimes you may think something is a novelty, but it has actually been addressed in the Quran or the Sunnah, or it has been addressed by the earlier scholars. But oftentimes the students are allowed to exercise reasoning for educational purposes. Certainly a student is not allowed to make fatwa or to give a religious edict, because you need to have the proper tools. And
of course.
But for educational purposes, you're allowed to experiment with reasoning.
And how do they experiment, Doctor?
They do quite well. Many of the students can actually arrive at the correct conclusion if they follow the proper procedures.
So how would we, Doctor, how would you advise the students or anybody that, how to study the fiqh? Would you start them at the Quran, the Sunnah, where would you actually pinpoint them to?
You know, to study fiqh is to study about Islam in general. You would certainly begin from the Quran, and that is at a very early age. You know, during one's early childhood, I try to memorize as much as possible of the Quran. But the study of fiqh itself will be from the traditional fiqh books that would also include, you know, the proofs from the Quran and the Sunnah. They will be sort of categorized according to the subject, so they are topically arranged. Usually the fiqh books start with the fiqh of worship, and then the fiqh of transactions. Usually, like, you know, how would they figure out the order of a book on fiqh? The scholars would figure it out this way. Fiqh is about regulating your relationship with Allah, the Creator, and your relationship with the creation.
Okay.
And so, but who's more important, the Creator or the creation? Creator.
Yes.
So you start with the fiqh of worship. And then when you start with the fiqh of worship, what is the most important worship? Our act of worship.
Okay.
That's the prayer. So they start with the fiqh of prayer. But before you pray, you need to purify yourself.
Of course.
So they put the purification before the prayer, or tahara, fiqh tahara, before the prayer, because it's a prerequisite, and so it needs to be done first. So they go through the fiqh of purification, then fiqh of prayer, and then fiqh of zakat, because the zakat usually comes after prayers.
Yes.
And then they put the fiqh of fasting, sawm, and then the fiqh of hajj, according to the hadith of Jibreel, when Jibreel asked the Prophet ﷺ about Islam, and the Prophet ﷺ gave him the answer. He put them in this order, so that's what the scholars use as an order.
Thank
and
you
then
so much,
we go
Doctor.
through the fiqh of transactions.
Thank you. I must stop you there, Doctor. We just got to go to a short break.
Right.
Well, stay tuned. We'll be right back after this short break. Assalamu alaikum.
Of Allah's favors can we deny? Above all creatures, He chose us to be high.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Eat Times. You guys, like we said, we're so happy that you invited us into your home for this lovely day. We want to greet all the Muslims all around the world and all around the universe on this lovely day.
Here we go. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. We're getting ready. We got to do this now, guys. You're ready. I'm ready.
Read your Quran, read your Quran, read your Quran. Just don't let it collect dust. No. Read your Quran, read your Quran, read your Quran. It's a guide, it's for all of us.
Well, I'm from the beach in Australia, so for me in the mountains it's very hard, brother. But you know, to get back to the beach is awesome for me.
On this lovely day, I promise you a very special guest all the way from Texas. That's right, Sheikh Yusuf Estes. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Yusuf.
Wa alaikum salam, Malik.
Sheikh, how did your last name rhymes with the state you come from? Estes, Texas. Texas, Estes. How'd you manage that?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi min shaitan rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. As soon as Ramadan is over, you won't see him again until the next Ramadan.
Sulaiman Omar Waziri is saying, my best experience on Eid is that the culture of spreading salam, hugging each other and showing happiness and mercy to each other, and also inviting people to come and share the little that we have in terms of meals and drinks. That's the main point.
You know, they worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during the 30 days of Ramadan. Suddenly they come to a sudden stop. That's not nice.
And actually, I feel like if we overindulge sometimes by celebrating Eid for too long.
And how can we offer thanks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? We offer thanks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by doing more good deeds after Ramadan. By continuing and doing good deeds after Ramadan. We don't offer thanks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by returning back to the bad habits.
First time ever to have Eid outside of America.
Wow. It's been my pleasure. It's been a wonderful time spending this time with you. I certainly hope to be here next year with you, and I certainly hope you are here next year as well.
Above all creatures, He chose us to be high.
Assalamu alaikum, and a very warm welcome back to Islamic Law with me, Rafee Abdul Maalik. As always, we have Dr. Hatem Al-Hajj joining us in the studio. Assalamu alaikum, Doctor. Thank you for joining us again in the studio.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you very much.
Well, before the break, we were talking about the fiqh of novelties. We're going to discuss in depth now about, Doctor, we want to talk about the main differences of fiqh from the past to the present. How did the scholars of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam time deal with these issues that, were novelties to them at that time?
Okay, so after the Prophet ﷺ, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, then there were different procedures now.
Okay.
Because like we said before, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the matter was much easier because the revelation would either clarify the ruling pertaining to this novelty, or the Prophet ﷺ would use reasoning to clarify the ruling. So it was, in both cases, decided by the revelation.
Okay.
Whether it is by the revelation initiating the ruling or the revelation approving the ruling, or by not commenting on it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the divine not commenting on it. Now, after the Prophet ﷺ, it was completely different, because no one's saying is final now.
Okay.
Even Abu Bakr, the best after the Prophet ﷺ, and Umar and Uthman and Ali, radiallahu anhum, may Allah be pleased with them all, none of them was infallible, was treated as an infallible person, or allowed to give final rulings on matters. So now, how did the Sahaba address the novelties? What was the first novelty, in the true sense of a novelty now that is not addressed by the revelation?
Exactly, Doctor.
Or it may be addressed by the revelation, but not in the sense of giving people like a roadmap. What do you do now? The first thing that they encountered that sort of puzzled them as to the right course of action was the very death of the Prophet ﷺ, because that was certainly shocking news to many of them.
Yes.
The Quran did say to them, and they were completely aware that the Prophet ﷺ is a human being, and that he will die at one point.
Of course.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, وَمَا مُحَمَّدٌ إِلَّا رَسُولٌ قَدْ خَلَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ الرُّسُلُ أَفَإِنْ مَاتَ أَوْ قُتِلَ انقَلَبْتُمْ عَلَىٰ أَعْقَابِكُمْ. And Muhammad was none but a messenger. Before him, many messengers had come.
Yes.
Will you then revert on your heels, meaning apostatize, when he dies, or when he gets killed, or if he gets killed? So the Quran did tell them that the Prophet ﷺ is basically only a human being in many verses, and that death will also apply to him. But the shocking news made some of them sort of overwhelmed by the impact of the news, to the point where Umar radiallahu anhu almost collapsed, and he was quite upset with people who said that the Prophet ﷺ died. Uthman could not, stand up from the grief, and so on. But then Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu reminded them of the verses. The verse that says that the Prophet ﷺ was only a messenger like all other messengers that came before him, and they remembered the news. When the news came to them, they overwhelmed them to the point where they even forgot everything, as if the verse was being newly recited to them. when Abu Bakr reminded them of it. So that's how they settled that matter. Yes, the Prophet ﷺ died. And then we have to deal with it now. And the second novelty is, what should we do? Where should we bury the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, may Allah be pleased with him, told them of a hadith that he heard from the Prophet ﷺ that the prophets are buried where they die.
Okay.
So that is another novelty, and like an encounter that they don't have a clear answer to.
Of course.
But then, so this was from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The first one, it was an ayah from the Quran that resolved the issue. The second one, it is a hadith from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ.
Yes.
Then what should we do in terms of the succession? Who becomes the ruler after the Prophet ﷺ? And there were some of the verses mentioned in a hadith by the Sahaba Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhu that made it clear who should become the next ruler. Then novelties continued to take place. For instance, when the Sahaba conquered Iraq and Egypt and greater Syria, and claimed those countries from the original occupiers, the Roman Empire, for instance, or the Persian Empire. And that was like an act of liberation, even as this is attested to or confirmed by the people of those countries who witnessed the change of authority between the Romans and the Sahaba ridwanullahi alayhim. They recognized how this was such a great act of liberation because of the suffering they had to endure under the Roman rule. But when this happened, the Sahaba acquired large areas of agricultural lands. And what should we do with this agricultural land that was acquired?
Okay.
And Umar radiallahu anhu reasoned that we should leave it with original farmers and take a reasonable tax from them for the state, and that is what they did, and that was. How did they arrive at this novelty? It was a special understanding of some verses in the Quran by Umar radiallahu anhu, certain verses that addressed the division of the estate acquired by the conquerors. The verses talked about how you divide them, and then the verses talked about who should get a portion of them. And later on in the verses, it also said, and the followers will get a portion of this land, which means all Muslim generations to come. And how do you make this land? How do you make the profit out of this land, or the revenue from this land? How do you make the followers entitled to some of the revenue of this land by making this land the land of the state, and not dividing it amongst people, just making it the land of the state, leaving it with the original owners, and taking some reasonable taxes. So that is a novelty that they encountered, and they were able to resolve in this way. There are other novelties that are of I wouldn't say necessarily lesser importance, but not of such magnitude, such as cheese, for instance. The Sahaba did not encounter cheese before. It was not one of the staples of Arab diet. So when they encountered cheese in Persia, it was a novelty.
Yes, novelty.
And so what do you do with the cheese? And the cheese also was made by the certain enzymes from the animals they slaughter. The Persians slaughter. The Persians were not Christians or Jews.
Okay.
They were Zoroastrians.
Okay.
So the animals they slaughter would not be permissible for us to eat.
I see.
But since the enzymes that are taken from the cheese, as reported by Abu Dawood in his Sunan, the Sahaba did eat the cheese because they figured that the enzymes that are taken from inside the animal are taken in very, very, very tiny portions. And they are liquids, basically. They are like pancreatic secretions and so on.
Okay.
So they are not flesh. So their impurity is, in the first place, weak impurity.
Very weak.
And you're also taking it in very, very, very small portions and adding this to milk to make cheese out of it. So they figured that it would be permissible to eat.
I see.
Because we have a concept in Islam, a legal maxim that says al-yasir ma'fiyun anhu, which means trivial things are exempt or pardoned. That's also a novelty.
I see.
And so basically, they would look for the answer in the Quran. They would look for the answer in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. They would try to make analogical deduction. They would try to use juristic preference.
Okay.
The use of juristic preference, for instance, which is istihsan, that is a concept that is agreed upon by all of the scholars to some extent. Imam Shafi'i theoretically opposed it, but he opposed what? He opposed the juristic preference that circumvents the text of the revelation.
Okay.
But juristic preference, as used usually by the scholars, is not meant to circumvent the text of the revelation, but rather to circumvent the technicality of fiqh. Because the technicality of fiqh can lead you to some inequitable solutions.
Yes.
So if the technicality of analogical deduction, for instance, leads you to inequitable conclusions, then you would use the juristic preference to reverse this and to not allow technicality to take you away from the spirit of the religion, equitable rulings, and so on.
Yes.
I can give you an example on juristic preference and how the scholars used it. Basically, if you borrow like an item from me, like if you borrow my car, and then it gets hit or
damaged,
involved in some accident and gets damaged, who should be liable in this case? You should be liable.
Definitely me, yes, if I borrowed your car.
Because you borrowed it.
No, yes.
Well, if I left my car with you to take care of it while while I'm overseas, I live in America, and when I used to live in New York, you had to move your car from one side of the street to the other side every day.
Yes.
For cleaning and so on. So if I leave my car with you to take care of it, and then it gets damaged, without negligence or transgression on your part, but I left it with you. You did not borrow it from me. Who should be liable?
Well, to me, Doctor, it would be the person who you've left it with, because it's in their hands. You've left the car in their hands, regardless.
Yeah. No, they're not. They did not do anything wrong. They did not neglect the trust. They did not transgress. They took care of it. They moved it from one side of the street to the other every day, like you said. But the car was right there, standing in front of their home, and it got damaged in an accident. In Islamic fiqh, I am liable. You're not, because you're just taking care of my car. You're doing me a favor.
Okay.
So you are a trustee, not a borrower.
Okay.
And the trustee will not be liable unless they transgressed or neglected their trust.
I see.
So let's say I leave some fabric with you to, like you are a tailor and I leave some fabric with you to make a garment for me.
Okay.
Now, if I leave the fabric with you, are you a trustee or a borrower?
I'd be a trustee.
Technically, you're a trustee.
Yes.
Thank you. You got it right. It is, you are a trustee. You're not a borrower.
No.
So that means what? If I come back and you say that, you know, the fabric was lost, we had a fire, and that we lost all materials in the store and so on. So who's liable here?
It would be yourself, Doctor, for leaving the material with the tailor.
Yes, I would be liable. Technically speaking, you're right.
Yes.
Because you're a trustee, you should not be liable. If you're the tailor, you're still a trustee, you're not a borrower.
Yes.
So technically speaking, if you use analogical deduction, which is qiyas, then you will say the trustee is not liable.
Okay.
But here is where, you know, juristic preference comes into the picture.
Yes.
So the scholars said that, and the first one to say this was actually Ali ibn Abi Talib, the companion of the Prophet ﷺ. So the scholars said that you should be liable as the tailor or the shoemaker or whatever should be liable. So why did they depart from the default, which is the trustee should not be liable? For various reasons. Because there is also, it is not like you're just doing me a favor. You're also making a profit out of this.
Exactly.
It's your business, and if you don't make the maker liable or the craftsman liable, then they will be negligent towards the stuff of the customers. You know, the materials the customers leave with them. This would lead to lack of trust in the market, and it would have harmful effects on the credibility of the market, and may result in losing people's property. So that is called juristic preference. Here, you deviated to some extent from the technicality, because the technicality was leading you into an inequitable conclusion.
Yes.
So these are the various ways they use to various tools they would use. They have at their disposal to address newly emergent matters.
To address them, Doctor, I very want to quickly ask you: would it not be fair to say everything that in the day of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, would everything be a novelty? So could we say the fiqh was all novelty in the day of Muhammad ﷺ, because they never came across anything that they thought was fiqh, or they were unsure?
There were no rulings before that.
Okay.
Basically, for the Arabs, they did not have scriptures. They did not have a book of regulations to go by. Okay. It was all a matter of customs and a matter of certain, settled customs of the people and habits and so on. But they did not have scriptures. They did not have any books that would instruct them about various rulings of various matters. So every new ruling was just a new ruling.
Okay.
And, so when wine was forbidden, it was forbidden gradually in stages, but every time it was sort of limited.
I see.
First, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala indicated that it is not wholesome by a hint or illusion in the Quran. That it is not wholesome, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, don't drink it, close to the time of prayers. So the only time that they were allowed to drink it is after Isha, because there were 5 daily prayers, and you don't want to be drinking it any time other than after Isha, because intoxication may still affect you during the next prayer, but between Isha and Fajr there was enough time to get beyond that intoxication or the effects of the intoxication. So this was basically weaning them from wine, because people who are addicted to these things, they have a difficulty going off them, sort of, as we say, cold turkey.
Yes,
you just need a process to be weaned. So that was a new ruling, and then when it was completely prohibited, it was still a new ruling. So everything that was legislated during this time was a new ruling.
Well, thank you so much, Doctor, for your thoughts. Thank you for sharing your thoughts in the studio today. Thank you for joining us. Well, that's all we have time for right now on Islamic Law. Please join us next time, and don't forget to send your comments on Facebook at www.facebook Islamic Law Today. Assalamu alaikum.
Which of Allah's favors can we deny? Above all creatures He chose us to be high. To Him we belong, to Him is our return. Life in this world is only a sojourn. To the angels He commanded that man be respected. Shaitan he did not, and so was he rejected. Compared to the angels, we are but clay. As long as Allah we obey, we'll not go astray.